Welcome to those who are signing on right now. We will start in a minute or so. Let the attendees come in. And meanwhile, you get to listen to this music, which is close to Muzak. So we will make sure that you don't have to listen to this for too long. Okay, so I'll start and the music will fade. Music is gone. Thank you, Netfa. My name is John Pfeffer. I'm the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies, and also the Director of Global Just Transition, which seeks to look at the transition to a fossil-free future from the perspective of different countries and at the multilateral level, and from a civil society perspective, what we can be doing to ensure that we not only get to a carbon-free future, but a globally just fossil-free future. Our event today, getting from the unsustainable here to the sustainable there, is part of our project looking at post-growth alternatives. And we have done a number of sessions in this series. And our latest is looking at some of the specific mechanisms that we want to focus on at a variety of different levels, at the scientific engineering level, at the kind of climatological level, at the political level, at the civil society level. And we have four very distinguished panelists. I'm going to introduce them right at the top very quickly, and then also introduce them as, again, as they begin speaking. They're going to give us about 10 minutes of opening comments, and then they'll have a chance to respond to each other, and then we'll have an opportunity to open it up to questions from all of you. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It would be best if you put your questions in there. You can also share your thoughts and your comments in the chat. It would be lovely to hear from people where you're phoning in from or where you're zooming in from. I'm in Northampton, Massachusetts at the moment. Our presenters are, as I said, very distinguished in their field. I'm going to introduce them in the order of their presenting. Susan Krumdieck is a professor and chair in energy transition at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, Scotland. Simon Michaud is an associate professor of geometallurgy at the Geological Survey of Finland. Renata Nita is a campaign strategist for Greenpeace International, and she's based in Brazil. And Vedran Horvat is the head of the Institute for Political Ecology in Zagreb, Croatia. I'm going to pass it on now to Susan. You have the floor. I'm going to mute myself, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, sure. It's great to be here from cold and frosty Scotland tonight. I want to make 3 points, and those 3 points hopefully spur new ideas. So the first point, probably most people listening to this will have already arrived at themselves, which is that the future is not like the past. The future won't be really governed by the same dynamics as the past. And in looking at the science about the future, the reliable modeling of where we're going, what we see is a man-made disaster. So that doesn't that doesn't sound great. So let's go away from that for a moment and see what we can learn from history. So when I look at history, so that's point 2, let's look at history. Let's look at the history of man-made disasters, but what we're looking for here isn't the fact that we produce man-made disasters. That does seem to be what we're relatively good at, but that's not the point. The point is that when there are man-made disasters, we correct. And I want to understand how we do that. All right, so let's look at the past. And when I look about 100 years ago in 1911, I see the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where 148 young women died on a day at work. And I see that that wasn't the only time that that happened, that roughly 40 coal miners a day were dying in the United States on the job. And in the UK in 1911, 5,600 people died on the job. And so what we see is that that isn't the case anymore. Yeah, maybe in Qatar, there was a lot of people dying on the job, and that's because they're not doing something that we do. And that something is safety engineering. So if we look at safety engineering, we see that it was a corrective discipline to a very successful system of mass manufacturing using low-cost immigrant labor. And that corrective was to go ahead and do that industry, but without killing the laborers. And the only way to do that was to look at what it was that caused the deaths, the loss, and to prevent that. So to prevent what's preventable, that's the corrective. And we see it again and again. After the Titanic went down, maritime safety emerged to not have that happen again. After earthquakes, after natural disasters, after toxic waste disasters like Love Canal, again, you see this emergence of a field that prevents that man-made disaster. So what we're left with is that today, if we count the climate and loss of biodiversity as man-made disasters, which we should, that is what they are. They are man-made disasters coming from otherwise profitable, legal, compliant, good engineering. The corrective to that. So how do we produce what we need? How do we carry on with our daily lives, but not do the thing that we must not do? How do we correct? And I'm going to propose, let's call that transition engineering, the work of downshifting fossil fuel production and consumption, and then engineering the adaptation and resetting of energy system and economic behaviors in that context. That is the project today. That is what 100 years from now, we're going to look back and see that that's what happened. The same way today, we look back and see that safety engineering came into existence 100 years ago, and it changed the future. Today in the UK, less than 150 people will die on the job, and not one of those is okay. Whereas 100 years ago, it was just the way things were. So we can change when we correct, when we develop a corrective discipline from within the engineering fields. And that's what I'm working on. And I hope that spurs some interest, because you can get the book Transition Engineering and you can train up in transition engineering, whether you're an engineer or not. All right, thanks. That's my opening remarks.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. I think we're going to be eager to hear some more about transition engineering and what that involves as we go forward. You were admirably brief, and I appreciate that. Next up is Simon Michaud, and as I had said at the top, Simon Michaud is an associate professor of geometallurgy at the Geological Survey of Finland. So over to you, Simon.
Hi, hello everyone. So I also have 3 points. Point number 1 is we are at this time hopelessly dependent on fossil fuels. All systems are still dependent, and it correlates strongly with oil in particular. Now, it has been shown that not only for climate change reasons, but we should get rid of oil quickly because it's becoming unreliable. It could be possible that peak oil is 4 years in our past. We can't really call it that yet, but it's possible. Second point is the task to phase out fossil fuels is much larger than we first thought. Much, much larger. So large that we really should have been taking this seriously 20 years ago, and we should have actually been doing industrial actions like results on the ground about 10 years ago, at the very least. But we didn't, right? And so a lot of the injury that society has done to itself has been inflicted through negligence. We didn't have to do it this way. The third point is once we've actually, for the last 14 years, we've been discussing about the green transition, and a plan's been put on the ground. But there was no actual feasibility study for macro scale industrial reformation. We just didn't have a plan. We just had some ideas. We didn't cost it out. We didn't get to the point where what power stations need to be made and what kind and where and who will pay for them. And what's the engineering required to keep each one running? Now, here we are, possibly past peak oil, and we still don't have a credible plan to phase out fossil fuels. So we're determined to do things the hard way. What I mean by that is I've done a study with some rough calculations where we need something like 586,000 new non-fossil fuel power stations to replace and phase out fossil fuels, where the existing system is only 46,000. The amount of minerals that we would need, most of that system's not been constructed yet, so we can't recycle it. The minerals that we would need in terms of production, mining production and mining reserves, we don't have enough minerals to do that. So obviously we're going to find some substitute systems, and we have to find them quickly. Also, a lot of the technology that we think we're going to use, we haven't thought through. Wind and solar in particular is highly intermittent. Now, for that to be viable at the moment, we need a power buffer. How big should that power buffer be? In the literature, they're suggesting things like all sorts of things, but I'm showing that that power buffer could be so large it's impractical. What that means is wind and solar cannot be the foundation energy system that we hope it is until we change. Either we change wind and solar itself, or we change our electrical engineering so it can cope with variable power supply. So we've got a lot of work to do, but now precious little time to do it. But we all need to do it, and we need to do it quickly. Okay, that's me.
Thank you, Simon. Also admirably brief, and I appreciate that. We're going to go now to Renata Nita. And Renata is a campaign strategist for Greenpeace International, which is, of course, as many of you know, a very large environmental NGO. And Renata is based in Brazil. So Renata, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, John, for the invitation. Hi, everyone. So I'm currently working in the Alternative Futures Project, which aims to really challenge and change the current socioeconomic system by elevating the voices of the global majority, and also amplifying and proposing some solutions that are already happening to respond to the climate and biodiversity crisis. So there's been a lot of discussions and proposals and the need to phase out fossil fuels to decarbonize economies and to protect tropical forests in order to mitigate emissions. And I think that, and now more recently, we've seen a lot of initiatives such as like Green New Deal in the US and Green Recovery Plan due to the pandemic, the economic crisis by the pandemic, which basically are coming from global north countries. So in this sense, it lacks the perspective, and more important, I think the insertion of peripheral economies, mostly the global south economies, into the world, the global world systems. And then we have to think about that global south countries have been undergoing centuries of cycles of development, let's put this way, which is the result of colonialism and is based on really the exploitation of cheap labor and common goods and natural resources, let's put this way. And those economies, they are really heavily dependent on the export of mineral and agricultural commodities. So when you think about the like plans to decarbonize economy, for example, to transition to electric cars, you have to think about like where those raw materials are coming from. And for example, more than half of the lithium resources are based in Latin America, for example, in a very dry area, and mining takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of water. You dispossess indigenous and traditional communities, you have environmental degradations, you have human rights violations. So other, for example, cobalt is another example. Half of the world cobalt reserves are in the DRC, and you have more than 14,000 children working in cobalt mines. You have, but at the other side, now coming to Brazil, it's last week there was a very remarkable initiative from the EU on the deforestation-free law. And as much as we know that, yeah, we have to stop deforestation, yeah, in order to save the climate, that's what we say, it still is quite a challenge for countries like Brazil, and especially in regard to the Amazon, where the whole economy is based on the exploitation of natural resources, on agricultural and mineral commodities. And in fact, there's like 28 million people living in the Amazon. So a just transition will have to take into consideration then what is left for those people, those countries as well. So there is this global scale that reflects the position of those global south countries in the world system, and then in the national scale as well. What are the options for the population of those countries? And so I do believe that every discussion about an ecological transition, a post-capitalist society, we have to start also think in terms of mindset shift. You know, we have to move from this very individualistic, very profit-driven society towards one that is more like onto sharing, onto the commons, on valuing care. And just to finalize, I think in this sense, we see that we have a lot to learn and to take into consideration what indigenous groups and traditional communities from this part of the world is doing and are telling us, because they have a different way to to see the world. Their cosmovision is really embedded with a different ethic, respecting the limits of the environment. And in fact, when we look at it, you can see that, for example, the deforestation rates inside an indigenous area can be up to 26% lower than non-unprotected tropical areas globally. So they are also like a very effective in terms of protecting the environment. And we have to start looking and considering that they can and should be part in the decision making and the political discussions, and for sure we have to start respecting also their constitutional rights. That's it from my side for now.
Excellent. Thank you, Renata. Also, thank you for keeping to time and for providing, I think, what is a very useful bridge, because your discussion of decision making will lead us to conversation about politics, which I think is what Vedran wanted to focus on. And let me give a quick introduction to Vedran. He is the director of the Institute for Political Ecology in Zagreb in Croatia, though I understand he's currently in Sarajevo in Bosnia at the moment. So Vedran, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you, John, for invitation. Yeah, I would also, to be coherent with other speakers, I can focus likewise on 3 points. Maybe starting with the context of the inflation and insecurity we are faced lately in Europe, and also speaking not only from Europe, but from the so-called European periphery, I would like to address 3 points. One is that, we like it or not, we are at the moment facing, let's say, at least some sort of zero growth scenarios for many European countries, particularly some core European economies are not predicting any growth in next few years. And that brings us into a rather unusual situation where we really need to address how questions how we can organize our lives and how also we can ensure well-being for all in the conditions of if not degrowth, then let's say zero growth. And I also approach to that with as a chance, as opportunity that we collectively think of conditions that are needed for us to be able to redefine what is sufficient, what is sufficiency, and also what is well-being. Now, obviously, this sort of degrowth is imposed by geopolitics. So it is in a way degrowth by disaster. We, of course, very much often like to address degrowth as the alternative scenario that is degrowth by design, where we program our developmental scenarios in relation to satisfy main needs and well-being, but not necessarily leading to economic growth. So it is also very much linked to redistribution of the current resources, fair and equal redistribution of the resources, and having in the background, let's say, democratic process as much as possible. So in these terms, we are facing now, and this is the first point, a sort of degrowth by disaster, which looks in a way as austerity, as many of the proposals that were in the degrowth debates already for years, now present in Europe, particularly on energy use, energy rationing, saving of energy, that are very legitimate proposals to save and less consume, are now being implemented without any resistance and truly for carbon environmental benefits. But the main point, of course, is they are still not a result of the voluntary shifts in the behavior. So I would like to just stress here that a democratic transition to degrowth is really necessary if we want to discuss this as viable alternatives, not being imposed by disasters or by crisis, as it is at the moment the case. Anyhow, as this is the case, we should think in direction of how to use it as opportunity. Second point is more related to issue of identifying of potential change makers who are there to, let's say, adapt our societies to new climate regime and fighting the logic of consumption and production as we get used to it. Again, of course, underlying need for new social contracts. In Europe, as you know, we have a European Green Deal, which is rather top-down program of many measures that are here to decarbonize our economy, but still failing to have democratic component developed sufficiently, and also to have redistributive component present to reduce inequalities and to address exclusion or injustice when tackling green transition. So maybe by referring to recently passed Bruno Latour, if we want to address that honestly, without any sort of denialism, we also have to be aware that these policy choices, which we are now facing, are also bringing some divisions and conflicts in societies. So it is inevitable question that is emerging here is how and who is supposed to manage these conflicts, particularly in situations where states are not sufficiently strong and where corporations might have completely different or colliding agendas. Anyhow, conflicts that are related to these policy choices will not disappear. So there is a need to also, particularly in Europe, where we already are witnessing sort of return of the state, we need to also see how this momentum can be also used to open more room for addressing post-growth scenarios for Europe as legitimate scenarios and not some utopian or fringe ideas. And thirdly, I would maybe focus here, particularly for Europe, and if we relate to just transition aspects of the post-growth debate, I would, of course, see one of these change makers in the circle of trade unions as potential, not always easy, and in many cases quite difficult partners, but necessary partners to tackle the justice element of moving toward post-growth scenarios. One of the problems we face here is that still post-growth scenarios are not yet politically represented in, let's say, representative democracy, and particularly not related to political power that can execute, that could be currently able to execute such scenarios. So that there is one of the necessities is to find out the ways how we can have political representation of this shift present in political arena. And I find that emerging of such an actor quite necessary if we want to really implement and to adapt to zero growth developments in many of European countries. So to come to also close, I think that it is not enough that we relate only to eco-modernization scenarios where technology will solve all our environmental and climate challenges, but to see if we can turn into advantage situation where zero growth is reality, and where we need to redefine partnerships and define the convergence points between state, trade unions, movements, and all those who might be left behind in adapting to this new regime. So thinking of society and state, which is not, which is, let's say, deprived, if we want to use negative wording, from growth, we should think instead of redefining the available resources, prioritization, and particularly in relation to distribution, and see if this redistribution can be coupled with redefinition of sufficiency and well-being in new conditions. I was a bit longer, but I think that there were some saved minutes before earlier, so I think we are just on time.
Yes, yes. In fact, we thanks to all, we're still on time, and I appreciate your keeping to your time. And also, I like the idea that we had this kind of full circle. We began with the triangle fire that Susan brought up, and we have ended with the importance of coordination with trade unions to move toward a global just transition. I want to encourage discussion among our panelists, and to do that, I'm going to throw a couple of questions at you. And meanwhile, I'm going to ask our audience to put their questions in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. Well, the first question I have is really a time frame question. You know, as Simon said, we should have been working on a fossil fuel-free future 15, 20 years ago, and developed, you know, more than just ideas, but actually concrete plans. And Susan, you have laid out something of a whole field, in some sense, of transition engineering, which I'd like to hear what time frame applies in those scenarios. And of course, for Vedran and the question of democracy, what does time frame mean in terms of our ability to kind of together democratically move very quickly to a fossil-free future, which we all realize is a necessity. And then in terms of, for Renata, what the time frame pressures, what those put on North-South relations and the incorporation of voices from the global South, and bringing those voices into the decision-making process. Susan, I want to start with you and hear your thoughts on this time frame question.
Yeah, the time frame question. Here's what I think. I know that myself, I went into mechanical engineering in 1981 as an undergraduate because of the OPEC oil embargo, because of the energy crisis, because of global warming, that thing we called it back then, because of the existential threats of biodiversity loss, etc. So I think that there are many other people like me who have been working on the big questions of what are we going to do. I think many other people like me probably got distracted like I did back in the late 90s on hydrogen and carbon capture and storage and biofuels, because we are engineers and these really impossible things to do are very exciting to work on. But now I've found my way, and I just kept asking the question, okay, what are we really going to do? And I believe that there are thousands and thousands of people around the world who are on that same journey. And here's the problem. For the last 2 decades at least, those of us who are getting more and more worried about the conditions and the fact that things aren't changing, and we're aware of just how, far we're going down the road that we shouldn't be going down. We want to do something. And so we find our superhuman cape, our superhero cape, and we put it on and we go to fight for, be champions. And unfortunately, that urge is divergent because we're all pulling in different directions. From our own perspective. We're not wrong, but we're not a discipline either. And so what I am proposing is that at this time, transition engineering, which is another one of these corrective transdisciplines, it has, it's not just engineering. Think about safety engineering. Safety engineering is about half behavior and about half organizational behavior, participatory behavior, understanding, awareness. All right, so we know that risk management and safety and these sort of corrective disciplines aren't just engineering, but you have to have the engineering in it. So what I'm going to say is that right now is when the convergence starts to happen, where all of the people who are aware, who know we have to do something different than we have before, we start to come together and we start to do the thing that has impact, which is to develop a discipline, right? That is how we got that much CO2 into the air. I've taught people for 20 years how to effectively, efficiently, and safely put CO2 in the air. I'm a mechanical engineering professor. The way that we structure disciplines, the way that we have standards, the way that we educate and have training and professional organizations, that is how effective impact happens. So it's time now for that convergence of people all around the world, all around this topic, into an effective discipline.
Excellent, thank you. Simon, you've talked about the fact that we don't have enough minerals, we don't have enough actual natural resources to build out the necessary alternative power stations. We have a brief period of time in order to kind of develop either other technologies or other organization. What do you think of this, discipline approach that Susan has brought up? Do you have other ways of conceiving of this?
It's a natural progression, exactly what Susan just said. I'd probably use different words, but it's exactly the same. The obvious outcome is our attempt to maintain the way things are now is not going to work. Once we accept that and we try and do something else, then all sorts of options are on the table. Now, I've been asked to develop a circular economy in context of the outcomes of my work. So I'm giving some thought about what Susan was actually sort of talking about. And the simple answer is the circular economy actually won't work and it needs to evolve into something else. But first, there's an evolution of the human, the social contract for us humans. We're going to go through a three-stage process. And the longer we take to do that, the longer it will take to do this. We are both the problem and the solution, right? So we've got to, first of all, understand the true nature of the challenge in front of us, all of the challenges together. Then we've got to understand our own genuine capability to do anything in face of those challenges. What are our options? And then for the third part is for the first time we can develop a plan. And that hasn't happened yet. And so we've got to go through all that. Once we get to it, we either work together, we realize that the solution is the person next to you, and we work together and we develop some sort of consensus plan, or we do nothing. And so we will actually sort of, and the word will be discipline, because if we are moving into a world where there's not enough to go around and we have to go without, we've been living a wonderful life for the last century or so, the golden era. Anything we wanted at a snap of our fingers. What happens when we have to work very hard for less outcome? So there are steps our industry will go through. Now I learned this from listening to Nicole Foss, and I went away and thought about it, that from a biological point of view, energy is the rate determining category that actually sort of allows the complexity and size of an organism to happen. If energy is reduced, then that organism must shrink in size and become less complex. That basic idea is also applicable to industry. And if we are stepping into a low energy future, that means our industry will have to reorganize around that energy system. It will be simpler and it will be smaller, right? Whether we like it or not. And so there's going to be a reshuffling and a reorganizing of energy around the new energy sources. And then people will reorganize themselves around those industrial hubs. And then our food production will reorganize itself around those people. And then we're going to go through the loop again as how much of this is practical or even possible. We have to go through that loop several times. And in and amongst all this, we've got to decide who we really are and what kind of world we want to live in. Therefore, do we turn on each other or do we work together? So in many respects, all the panelists are saying the same thing. We've all got our hands on the same problem, but from different angles.
Excellent, thank you. Your discussion of a new social contract, to me, is fundamentally a political question. So I'm going to turn to Vedran and see what your thoughts are in terms of the demands, the urgency of the crisis we face, the time frame and the shrinking of the time frame, and this kind of need for a new social contract, how that kind of translates into political thinking.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that temporality is of huge importance, but also we should not overestimate it and see it very linear. If we remember that 50 years ago, there was a Club of Rome saying that there are limits to growth. It took us 50 years to come here and to say that our house is on fire, as Greta Thunberg says. So it took us, there is no like a sudden panicking as it is often presented. We had half a century to realize the thing that was already been said and expressed by Club of Rome in 70s of the past century. So I think that already then we knew that there are limits and boundaries to our growth, and that planet doesn't not have indefinite wealth for the all projected abundance. So I think that obviously we are already too late. We are too late, but I don't see it as a reason not to act. It is more the question of how we act. And for democracy, as you asked, there is always, of course, we need time for democracy. On the other hand, there is urgency. There is urgency to act immediately with 2025, 2030, 2040 scenarios. All are very needed and necessary to have a short-term immediate action. On the other hand, we know that in many countries, societal majorities are not yet adopting or accepting that a sort of sacrifices needs to be made, at least if we compare to what was business as usual. But again, false solutions can cost us also a lot of time. I'm not here, neither I have time to speak about false solutions, but I would say that anything that is denying ecological limits for our economy to adapt to is very close to that. And as mentioned earlier, circular economy obviously has some sort of positive environmental or climate impact, but again, it does not learn us to consume less. We will maybe bring some resources into circulation, we will repair them, we will use them again. That is all good and needed, but it does not actually say that consumption is that we need to learn to consume less and to consume what we need, and to maybe relearn how our lives can look like, and that this is not a tragedy if we consume less. So I think it is part of collective learning that is prerequisite, precondition for any deliberative backup of these top-down decisions, because obviously governments and the commission and transnational governance regime are all engaged into delivering quick solutions, top-down solutions, without time invested into democratic processes, and that is obviously a very big point. But again, it is not a reason not to dive deeper into society and bring these debates into society and enable, wherever possible, citizens to learn how their lives need to be transformed so that they still can have a well-being without feeling that they make any sacrifice. And one more, just last point, when we say we don't have enough resources to maintain, we are not yet questioning what are the current, what is that everything that, for example, energy is used for this moment, and if we really need all of that to maintain the current system. I think that anything that says that some things need to be shrinked or they need to be adapted or calibrated to meet the new reality is not necessarily something that needs to be expected with fear or anxiety. It is rather investment into long-term investment and in the future, and more responsible toward future generations if we want them to live in a just as possible world.
Excellent, thank you. We've got some questions in the Q&A, and I'll get to those in a moment. I want to turn to Renata. The question of sacrifices is, of course, a key question, whether we're talking about degrowth by design or degrowth by disaster. But often the sacrifices, and more often these days, have been in the green transitions have been kind of exported to the global south. So sacrifices, for instance, for communities around lithium mines or cobalt mines, sacrifices for communities living in dirtier manufacturing zones that no longer are tolerated in the global north. So I'm curious about this question of time frame as it applies to North-South relations, where the global south becomes the place where people have to make sacrifices in order for us to meet the time requirements that we failed to meet earlier as a planet.
Well, it's been centuries like that, right? So I don't expect this to change so fast, even though it's utmost necessary. But what I see is that there are some key elements that could really push and support the transition of those the global south countries towards a different model of development, such, for example, finance. Yeah, and it took 30 years to agree on a finance mechanism for loss and damage. Yeah, so and we can't wait more 30 years to define the rules for financing the transition. So in a way, and thinking about like shifting the power dynamics, not only globally, but internally as well. Yeah, when you look at the national level, you have to also shift the power dynamics and move from the lobby of big corporation on governments to really, for example, as Vedran mentioned, yeah, so you really create processes that are more bottom up instead of top down, and you include the marginalized groups and protect them and assure that the rights are being respected. It takes a lot of time, but at the same time, I mean, there is no, what are our choice? I mean, we have to keep pushing, and yeah, and we have to start working in solidarity, in collaboration with all the groups, all the social movements that are also on this. And because I don't see any other way that we can create some faster changes on. It's our job to start and not give up on pushing and pointing to the real responsible and demanding concrete changes from corporations, from polluting activities, and also to push for the discussion about what kind of development that peripheral economies must have in this new world order as well. Over.
Thank you. Excellent. We've got some questions, and I'd like to go to our questions now from the audience. And here I'm going to ask panelists to just raise your hand or otherwise indicate that you'd like to answer this question. You don't all have to answer all the questions. But the first question from Karen is on the question of crowdsourcing. I mean, you know, the whole COP model of governments coming together to kind of address this question of carbon emissions and reducing carbon emissions has been a frustrating one. And we've got the Paris Agreement. We've got recently an agreement on loss and damage, no money necessarily associated with that fund. Still, it's been a frustrating experience to watch these take place 27 times and for us not to be substantially much further along in decarbonization, much less the other challenges we face. But what about crowdsourcing solutions from people more generally? That could be crowdsourcing solutions among scientists and engineers, crowdsourcing solutions among civil society organizations. Has crowdsourcing advanced enough as a method to address some of the problems we face in climate change? Simon.
So I don't know if I've got the correct answer here, but I'm actually connected to and talking to lots of governments and civil servants around the world now. Finland, Sweden, you know, the US Department of Energy. There's all sorts of people I'm talking to. And I'm finding that over time, when change happens, it's not when you have like a mass consciousness shift by large people as such. Obviously, yes, that's relevant, but that there seems to be, the way we operate now is there's a relatively small number of people embedded in our civil service, in our industrial political infrastructure. And they're not necessarily elected officials either. They're the people who advise those groups. When they choose to move on things, things move very quickly. And to influence those people, trying to actually find them in the first place is hard, but trying to actually sort of get the some change happening through official channels and discussion doesn't work, because the established paradigm doesn't want to change. They're having just a great time with growth and money and power and all that. They don't want to hear about change. So what I've come to the conclusion is a network of badly behaved scientists and engineers who just do stuff without permission. They just do it. They develop things. Like my 1,000-page report that went out and has lit a fire, that wasn't originally done as a consequence of me being told to do it. I just did it, and it landed on my boss's desk as a draft, and the expression on his face was excellent. But then he looked at us, all right, yeah, this is good, let's do it. And so then it went out from there. And so the transfer of information has to be handed round by people. You don't wait for permission, you just do it. Now, then it has to be understood by a large number of people, and then you get the consciousness shift. You only need about 4 or 5% of the human population to change their mind on something, and then there's a, no, we're not having this, and we're moving. Right, but most of humanity at the moment is still inured with the idea of the existing formula. So that change has to happen outside of the established paradigm somehow.
So in effect, you've added to Vedran's list of change makers. You've identified another group, two groups, both badly behaved scientists and engineers, but also these kinds of key civil servants who are I hesitate to call them a deep state of civil servants who would be.
No, that's a different group again. What I'm referring to are the people who actually on a day-to-day basis get stuff done and administer things, and they advise politicians.
Yeah.
They're the ones that actually sort of are managing all these big reports and managing the flow of money. They are accountable and they are visible, but it's in the machinery of governance. They're the ones that actually, they don't see themselves in charge. They don't see themselves in control, but they're the ones that if they've decided that they've had enough, change happens.
Excellent. Well, let's add them to the list as an important constituency to reach out to and identify as much as possible. Other panelists, if you want to weigh in, just put up your hand or indicate with the raise hand function. Otherwise, I'll go on to the next question. Next question is a question of rationing fossil fuels, and this is a proposal that has been circulating. This could be part of, degrowth by design, if you will, a way of gradually ratcheting down the amount of fossil fuels used country by country, and providing various carrots and sticks to encourage that process along. Anybody have thoughts on this rationing fossil fuels approach? Simon does, but does anybody else? Susan, yes. Susan first, then Simon.
All right. In the analysis, I would say, maybe analysis isn't the right word, in the probing of possibilities for how the downshift of fossil fuel and all of the activity that would imply could possibly happen. The rationing of fossil fuels on purpose by the fossil fuel producers is the way that it could happen. And that requires a business model which is more profitable to downshift the production of fossil fuel than to continue to explore ever more expensive, deeper, farther out there resources. And if you start looking at that, what you see is that that is not implausible. And so the work of understanding why the oil companies would do that, what the business model would look like, and that really policy-wise, what would the policy be if the oil companies decided they were going to apply the carbon tax? They're going to organize themselves, apply the carbon tax, pivot into what is going to be a big money maker when the amount of fossil fuel being supplied to the economy is lower, and then engineer that transition. I think that is a very interesting discussion to have.
Excellent, thank you. Susan. Simon, did you want to add?
Yeah, so there is a wind of change that's happening amongst societies since for the last 10, 15 years, right around the planet, especially in the last couple of years, and especially in Europe at the moment. Europe, I'll come back to that, but there is two basic questions that are on the lips of many, many people around the world at the moment. Question one, do our leaders know what they're doing? Question two, can they be trusted? And the answer for both of those questions is no. That's the conclusion we're all coming to. So if we're going to go to the idea of can we sort of collectively do rationing, right, that would be the sensible, intelligent response if we could have a social contract where there was trust amongst all levels of society. But that trust has been absolutely destroyed. Right, so what I think will happen is fossil fuels will naturally start to contract, and we will start to have the idea where they'll be difficult to maintain. I do believe parts of society will try and take fossil fuels and the outcomes of fossil fuels for self-benefit. I mean, we're seeing elements of that now, right? And the way we stop that is full transparency and transference of data that can be checked, right? And once we actually get to the point where, come on guys, we can see what you're doing. And not only can we see what you're doing, but we're not going to have it, right? So then we can get to the point where, well, okay, perhaps we should, get off this system anyway. And we can collectively, in terms of like, can we step down or can we transition off? But we have to clean house. We have to clean house in terms of socially, how we do things, why we do things, who's in charge, and what do they really want of those people in charge.
Excellent. A quick follow-up from Jack, who asked the question about rationing of fossil fuels. What social supports do we need in place to make rationing acceptable? Thinking back perhaps to times when rationing was socially acceptable during wartime, for instance.
Understanding?
Understanding. Can you?
Everyone involved needs to understand what's happening and why.
I think a system that does the rationing is a primary requirement. I mean, think about it. Seats at a Queen concert are rationed. There's only so many. If we didn't know how many there were, and all of us who wanted to see a Queen concert simply turned up, it would be a disaster. And so the system that lets us book in and manage our expectations is essential. Does that system exist for fuels? No. So let's build that.
Excellent. Renata.
I think there is also, in terms of social mobilization and engagement, we tend to overlook the power of some, let's put this way, real utopias, of like being able to radically rethink about alternatives, about possibilities. I do believe that yeah, we have some very concrete things that we have to do. But more than this, I think we are all living in a very like a doom environment. Yeah, we're like constantly bombarding by doom messages. So, and kind of, and it's been, and there's some very interesting studies showing that this empowers people as well. So I think, and for quite some time, the environmental movement was quite good using those messages of like the end of the world. But it is also time that we have to change, because it's not that change is not happening, it's not that people are not doing different things, you know, trying to solve or sort or build resilience in their community. This is happening elsewhere, everywhere, you know, and it's our job as researchers, as environmentalists as well, to start talking to people about those ideas, and the power of those, of creating and generating and amplifying those ideas, we cannot underestimate.
Excellent. So in some sense, the crowd is already responding to the crisis at a local level. We have a variety of different community initiatives. The challenge in some sense is learning from those, but also linking them up somehow. And one of the participants in an earlier session from India was involved in a project very similar to that, taking all of the different community level responses in India that were unknown from community to community, and building a kind of central clearinghouse for sharing of that information from community to community within India. One could imagine, in some sense, a global structure like that as well. Vedran.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to also to follow up on the last question. I think that, I mean, for those of us who are in Europe, we know that, for example, already now, as I mentioned earlier, maybe now to support it with concrete examples, the rationing measures that are related to, you know, air conditioned temperatures in offices, or these heating of the swimming pools, lightening the monuments, and such different sort of different, very broad range of measures that have been introduced to decrease energy consumption, are in the context of explanation of the energy crisis in Europe due to war in Ukraine, are self-understood and so far quite widely easily accepted. So I think that it is issue of solidarity also to see that our comfort is sometimes also hurting other people. And this is also issue of understanding that continuing as we used to keep our comfort at this level might have very detrimental impact on life of people on another side of planet. So I think that we need to think of the ways how we can nudge, let's say, nudge public opinion toward the options where the feeling of well-being will not be tremendously shaken. On the other, in the same time, using all available opportunities to save energy, and not only and to continue to do it even if the and when the, you know, the war is over, because it is, I think, matter of two or actually three imperatives. One is to not continue to hurt the nature and to be able to maintain the nature at least where it is now, to enable large-scale redistribution that would fit all the needs as much as possible, and to also enable emancipation of those whose work is who are exploited in all sorts of extractive industries across planet that are continuing to support or to depend or rely on fossil fuels. So I think that these three, the nature, the community needs and citizen needs, and particularly those who are deprivileged or left behind, we need to think of these three imperatives when trying to design a scenario that can work for all.
Excellent. Thank you, Vedran. We have three last questions. I'm going to try to group them together into, well, two questions. The first is this question of trigger point. And Simon had alluded to to peak oil and the fact we probably had passed it some time ago. But what could be the trigger point for this kind of either, we've expressed it in different ways, a new social contract, a new consciousness surrounding our predicament of humanity. We've seen a number of events that have been identified in the press as, game changers, whether it was the recent floods in Pakistan or it's, the war in Ukraine and the kind of limits on energy use that it is imposing, not just on Europe, but elsewhere in the world. What do you think would be a trigger point that could, mobilize people in ways both to accept sacrifices, to accept rationing systems, to accept, different behavior on a daily level, but also, and this alludes to what David Barkan said, would accept major controls on powerful actors in society, like fossil fuel companies? What will be the trigger point that will enable those changes? And I'm going to go first with Susan and then to Simon.
All right, which disaster is big enough, eh? All right, let's go back to that history example that I was talking about how when we really do see these trajectory changes throughout history, and what we see is that it's not people who start changing things, people as in the end users. It's the upstream. It's people looking at the stopping the potential for those disasters, preventing what's preventable. And so if we look at it in that way, then in 2010, there was enough recognition of disaster for about 100 engineers to get together to form the Global Association for Transition Engineering. And that disaster, the thing that seemed to catalyze us finding each other and getting together was that it became quite clear that the Kyoto Protocol was going to fail. There was not going to be any, the Kyoto Protocol was not going to make a blip of difference. Well, this is something that you've counted on, right? This was how we were going to abate and change and all that stuff, and not one bit of difference. And then also in 2010, the Deepwater Horizon blew up. And when it becomes evident that we are going that deep and that far, and also in 2010, the fracking explosion started happening, right? The losing, doing things with fracking that it's clear we should not be doing. I think those seem to be the galvanizing moments for the people who got together at that time. That was enough. That it's clear that peak oil has occurred, and that we are going down a very dangerous path that we don't plan to correct for any reason. And so therefore we have to start working internally to the systems that are causing the risk and the dangers and change them. And in those changes, make sure that we help the end users adapt. So that's what it will look like to people, is relief from the pressures they're feeling, a better way to do things. And if you don't believe me, go online and look in real estate advertisements. And what you'll see is an awful lot of advertising around walkable neighborhoods, access to public transport, green spaces. So, you know, the demand is there. You can move the demand, but you have to produce the product. You have to produce the change. So yeah, I think we just get on with it. Join transition engineering if you like. You don't, again, I keep reiterating, it's not just engineers, about half engineers, that's all.
Excellent, thank you, Simon.
So historically, when we've sort of seen, people at large really sort of move, really sort of say, we've had enough, right? Most of these issues are only understood by a very small number of people. Relatively, there's still the kitchen table issues. Most people are still sort of, in the daily grind, one foot in front of the other. They have no awareness of this, but they will move very quickly if, for example, if they're hit with a food shortage, or if there's some sort of thing they vitally need to get by, something that affects them directly. Now, in the past, it's been food. The correlation between when food is unavailable or the cost of food goes so high that we start seeing civil unrest. Sounds dramatic, but I think some of the problems we're going to see next year with the food supply chain, which have been flagged, might raise the general issues into the human consciousness across the board. And then we might start seeing people starting to take these problems seriously, like it is their problem. They do have to do something about it, or they're in trouble. I think it's going to be something like that.
Excellent, excellent. So we have time for this one last question. And I'm combining two questions, one from Auden about government intervention and one from David about power relations, both within societies and between societies. Obviously, we've been in a long, several decade long trajectory of reducing government involvement in economies, this so-called neoliberal or globalized approach to economies, reducing the number of levers that governments have in the economy. And the question is, will that need to be reversed in order to address our current climate crisis? In other words, do we need more government intervention in order to restrain certain powerful actors, such as fossil fuel companies, but also in order to implement agreements? I mean, the Paris Agreement, for instance, is voluntary. There's no enforcement mechanism. It's up to the national governments whether they, in fact, meet the targets that they promise to meet. So do we need more government intervention? And second, in terms of the power relations within society, obviously, those of you from the United States know that it was largely the vote of a single West Virginia senator that doomed what would have been an even more significant piece of climate legislation in the United States, obviously someone who is connected to powerful fossil fuel companies. How do you address those powerful power relations within society? And as Renata was talking about, the serious power gap between the global South and the richer countries of the global North. So, long question, short answers. Simon.
That depends on the government in question, whether they develop a plan that's credible and the voting population believes them. If they can come up with a plan that is sensible and then everyone get behind them, sure, more government intervention might work. If they can't do that, or if it's appearing like, you know, what happened at the end of the Roman Empire, where it became clear that the government wasn't really acting on the interests of the large amount of the population, they won't be believed. At which point, not only will there be less government information, but intervention, but a parallel system will develop because it has to. And then the social mandate to govern will transfer from one system to another.
Good, excellent. Vedran.
Yeah, also briefly, I just wanted to mention that we see at every COP how governments are weak, as they are not able to make an agreement that would be sufficiently strong to be immune toward particularly, of course, fossil fuel companies, but also other corporate sector components. So I see that, of course, I understand that addressing this in US and Europe has quite different implications. But of course, I would see return of government as essential to address also policy choices that are necessary for abandonment of fossil fuels. And ultimately, it is governments who have to operate in public interest. And it is, at least what is in my point of view, it is really a public interest to address climate crisis and new climate regime, but also post-growth scenarios as viable alternatives to the business as usual. So I would say that we need government for this policy shift, and we also need government, but not only government, to manage redistribution that relates to risks related to different groups that might emerge from this policy shift.
Good. I'm going to give you all a last chance to say some concluding remarks. I want to begin with Renata, if Renata's ready to give some concluding remarks. It can be quite short. And in response to this last question or to any of the previous questions or comments.
So, yeah, about this last questions, I agree as well that governments should take control and start and has this the role to prioritize the well-being of society as a whole. And also there is an important factor to consider, which is the power of the corporations and some very powerful sectors as well. So because the market won't address and resolve the climate and the biodiversity crisis, often what we see is a market-based mechanism proposed by companies is more greenwashing than so they can keep the business as usual, the business model. So in the sense, so it is important for government to keep those corporations accountable and put them in line. So at the end, it's about the environment and the society well-being.
Excellent. Thank you. Susan, any last thoughts?
I find that I've run out of time now that I'm a granny. I have run out of time to think about things that I can't do anything about, right? So the way the market works, the way politicians work, there's just so many things that I could spend energy on worrying about or something. So I'm laser focused on direct line of sight to the changes that are required and finding how to make a change in a place. We may very well develop a artifact, a system, a mechanism for change that can scale. So for example, like I just said, a way to manage the use of oil in a particular place. That's just a system, and that's a thing that can be developed. And so, yeah, I would just encourage everybody to try to make that shift. Say, okay, I'm one of the people who understands lots of the issues involved, and now I'm going to learn how to go about making changes and discovering those pathways.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. Last thoughts, Simon.
Right. So what's pretty clear to me is, the boundary conditions going forward is the relationship between society and energy, society and raw materials like minerals, and the relationship with money is all going to evolve into something else. It's all going to shift into something else. And at the moment, there's not a lot of discussion about what that could be. Now, if we're moving into a world where there's not enough to go around, we have to agree to work together or we turn on each other. And the only way that will work is if we have a series of representative governments that we actually trust to actually engage on our behalf in an ethical and responsible fashion. So we will need government in some form, but that government would then have to administer a new system that doesn't exist yet in a paradigm that doesn't exist yet. And so my work going forward is to build the tools to try and understand what that might be. I see myself as like at the interface between the old world and the new world. So I'm going to make some tools and hand them off to other people as they go past me.
Excellent. And finally, Vedran, last thoughts.
I would just briefly like to say that time is precious, and I will use the Croatian word that is translation of the word digru, which in Croatian doesn't sound negative. It means to grow up and to be mature. So I would end on a general note that we should be enough mature to be able to cooperate and to be able to identify that we don't have indefinite set of options to ensure the life of the future generations.
Excellent. Thank you all. You've been wonderful panelists. You've been a wonderful audience. We will be putting this video up on our site if you want to see it again, along with all the other videos in this series. And we will also prepare an article based on this event as well. So once again, thank you all for coming. My name is John Pfeffer with the Institute for Policy Studies, and I look forward to seeing you at our next events.